Shalom and welcome back to the Rabbi Avi Show. Today we are truly blessed to be joined by a voice that is quickly becoming one of the most influential in the Jewish world. He's a bridge builder, an academic, and a podcaster in his own right, hosting the thought-provoking show, The Fifth Question. I'm thrilled to welcome Rabbi Daniel Levine. Daniel, just tell us all about yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you. I currently live in Irvine, California. I'm both the Hillel rabbi for Hillel at UC Irvine, and then I'm also a Jewish studies lecturer at UCI, teaching classes in Jewish history and Jewish philosophy. And I've been doing this for about 9 years. So it's been, the only place I've ever worked, but it's been an incredible opportunity. As we were talking a little bit offline, I grew up in an Orthodox community. I spent a couple of years living in Israel in various Orthodox yeshivot, ultimately received smicha through the Rabbanut, and then halfway through college, happy to get into this, sort of ventured away from the Orthodox Jewish community, but stayed very much within, what I consider to be just the pluralistic, post-denominational soup of American Judaism, and, have never looked back.
You have a family, you've got a wife, you've got a little one. Is that right?
We have an 11-month-old baby, so
That's
that means
exciting.
5 a.m. wake ups and everything. No, but it's incredible. It's been a great year. Very steep learning curve, but it's been incredible.
Was there something that was a spark that moved you from being a scholar of the past to being a leader for the future?
Ooh, that's interesting. So it actually, funny enough, it kind of went the other way around. I think in terms of my upbringing in the Orthodox community, and this is one of the things that I often bemoan educationally about the Orthodox community. It's interesting because, we all probably know lots of people who grew up Orthodox and have left the Orthodox community, whether personally or sort of in pop culture, because people sort of, eat up those type of stories. I would say most of them have, they sort of like look back at their time in the Orthodox community with ill memories, or they're very happy they left it. I love the Orthodox community, both in the past and currently. I think it's actually a shame that most other American denominations have not been able to foster the same type of community and, awareness of what's going on in Jewish background that the Orthodox community has. And so I had never, my goal was never to find a way, how can I, leave this community, break out? And there's a lot more than what I'm about to say, and happy to, double click on any piece of it. But I was always interested in Jewish tradition, specifically Talmud, because in the Orthodox yeshiva system, that's what's studied for, 12 to 15 hours a day. Maybe you spend an hour learning Torah and maybe another hour on sort of, general Jewish thought. But really, it's Talmud and Gemara study that is the be-all, end-all. And so I've always been very interested in sort of the intellectual side of Orthodoxy for those that are, Jewish history nerds. I grew up in the modern Orthodox community, very much mirrored after, the Brisker school, Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, where it's sort of hyper intellectual. And when I got to college, this was already after years of yeshiva, I had known that I wanted to be a rabbi. And I wanted to do Jewish education. I had thought about wanting to do something in the Kiruv world, so maybe with an organization like AISH or NCSY. And at some point in college, I realized, I should actually learn about, other ways to view Judaism that aren't just Orthodox, not because I genuinely cared, but because, how can you be an effective Kiruv rabbi if you don't actually know where the people that you're trying to talk to are coming from? And that led me to start to do a lot of reading about Jewish history. Now, in the Orthodox community, you actually don't learn that much about Jewish history. Like, yes, things are in some way contextualized. Everyone could tell you Maimonides was, lived in the Middle Ages. But the idea of Jewish history in the academic sense, where you are explicitly recognizing the fact that, like all things in the world, Judaism is a system that undergoes change and evolves, sometimes from inside forces and sometimes from outside forces. And it's this organic living thing that is not, this essence that is unchanging, that goes all the way back to Moses at Sinai, which is very much, at least the Orthodox view I grew up with, sort of started to knock me off, in the Orthodox world, you say, the derech. And the more I, studied and read and talked to professors about just what we know about Jewish history, what we don't know, questions of biblical authorship and historicity and archaeology, it wasn't that I didn't want to remain a part of the Orthodox community. At some point I woke up and, there was a lot more emotional turmoil than I'm letting on here. But I just realized, like, oh my goodness, I actually don't agree with, the sort of central tenets and dogmas that this community is based around.
That's a lot. I mean, one of the parts, and I feel like in a way I've gone in a different direction, but and we have a lot of common ground there. But one place where I think that we disagree is on biblical criticism. I've kind of latched on to a very traditional view of Torah Mina Shamayim, and it seems from what I've read about you that you have latched on to biblical criticism. And I would say that there's plenty of room for that. It's not really that important per se, what somebody believes or doesn't believe in our tradition necessarily, but it is very interesting. So can you tell our listeners about your relationship or not relationship with Torah Mina Shamayim versus biblical criticism?
Sure. I will say just at the outset, the background is that my goal is never to convince people that believe in single mosaic authorship to accept biblical criticism. So I'm not one of these people that, everybody has to believe this exact same thing because I think it's the rational view. I did go through a phase of that in college, but, it was very short-lived. And so I will say that at the outset, in terms of the essential, I would start here. The Torah/Tanakh makes a number of historical claims that you would imagine you'd be able to compare to the archaeologic record and the socio-political record and what we know about other ancient empires. And starting in sometime in the 1800s, this is mostly European academies, mostly done by actually religious scholars. So starting off with Protestant scholars and then eventually Jewish scholars. Once the tools of, say, the scientific method, started proliferating and were available to everybody, there was a sense of like, okay, great, let's use these same tools to sort of, prove that the Bible, did historically happen and is on sound archaeologic footing. And so early enough when, teams of archaeologists went to the Middle East to look for things that, if the biblical narrative was true at face value, you would expect to see some remainder of, say, the Israelite trek through the desert, or some remainder of the conquering of the city of Jericho, as talked about in the book of Yoshua, of, the massive walls coming down. And, you sort of get the point. Obviously questions of a global flood, that cover everything. And the more archaeologists sort of scoured the land, it came to a much different story of, what we now know to be sort of the quote-unquote academic historic record. At the same time, people were using age-old tools of parsing, the biblical text, and these are age-old tools because much of Midrash and the Talmud and medieval Jewish commentators do the same thing, where they look for discrepancies in the text, or it actually seems like, say, this text repeats itself in two different places, or it seems like this law is repeated twice. You have two sets of the Ten Commandments is probably one of the most famous ones with, just one word, Shamor or Zachor, being different. And obviously that creates a very rich ground for biblical discussion and exegesis. And, the Midrash and Talmud wouldn't exist if it wasn't for that. But then when, academics took a more, let's say fine-tuned literary approach, they realized that if you look at what we know from the historic record in terms of what we know to be true in ancient Israel, say with the split between the North and South Kingdom as talked about in the book of, Malachim or the book of Kings, and take, regional differences in terms of northern cities versus southern cities, and actually begin to parse, where does it make sense that one story has fact A and a different story has fact B, and you actually separate those narratives into two different narratives. A lot of the biblical texts can actually hold as their own as composite texts. And this leads, again, there's a lot of different things that people mean when they say biblical criticism, but I would say, to summarize it, without talking for the next 4 hours, it's the idea that, one, the Torah was not written, single-handedly by either Moses or God, that it was a composite text by different groups of people over the course of hundreds of years, reacting to various socio-political concerns that were happening around. And when that matches up with, again, what we know about the archaeologic record of, okay, when do we actually have, proof, quote-unquote, or support that different kingdoms existed and different kingdoms fell apart, and Sanherib destroyed the north and the Babylonian exile, and you compare it to other texts that we have from other ancient empires such as Enuma Elish, just to name one, the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon, to name another. There's a lot more parallels there, which lead most scholars to think that, okay, the Torah is actually made up of these different texts that were created at different times.
can that viewpoint actually deepen your commitment to Torah, or what does that do to your relationship to Torah, having that point of view?
It's such a good question. So initially it did, because I was coming from an Orthodox background. And so the Orthodox community is a very, halacha-centric, right? If nothing else. In other words, halacha is, or Jewish law, I'll just define it for listeners, is binding on, any single person. It doesn't matter how much you, want to watch the NFL game this weekend, like it's Shabbat, you don't turn on the TV on Saturday. And also, more extreme examples. It doesn't matter how much you might be, say, offended by sensitivities of, saying gay marriage is asur or forbidden, sorry, that's what the Torah says. And so it's a very, Jewish law is binding, that's what it says. Obviously, there's a little bit of wiggle room, internally within halacha, but in terms of the major contours, those are pretty immovable. So initially, coming to at least the conclusion that I did, that many of the original laws in the Torah came up because of various, socio-political reasons, it definitely took me out of a place of viewing that halacha needs to be the be-all, end-all of my Jewish practice. And since then, about 11 or 12 years ago, I have not been a completely halachically observant Jew. That said, at the same time, just to finish off sort of the flip side, is my connection to Judaism, Jewish tradition, and Jewish peoplehood in some way has been enhanced by this, because the classic Orthodox narrative of this tradition being essentially something that was just handed to us top down without us doing anything, right, which is very much, the classic Orthodox theology is, the Jewish people are, we're just chosen, right? We didn't choose, we were chosen. And so, it very much takes the, we are the subject that's acted on in some way, not the object. This view is actually, Jewish tradition is a bottom-up creation of the Jewish people, and it's so deep and so rich and has stood the test of time, and it is able to be both traditional in a way that grounds us and innovative in a way that, keeps up with the times and is always exciting and always coming out with new ideas. That idea has led to, I think, a greater inspiration in terms of overall Jewish tradition than I might have had, 13 or 14 years ago.
How does anyone in your position sift through so now what are my parameters? And I've talked about this before recently on an episode, talking about the slippery slope notion of, maybe it's okay for me to do this, and by the way, this, and before you know it, we don't necessarily have the same parameters as halacha or limitations. So then where do we not only draw the lines, but where do we find ourselves? It leads to a lot of questions. I guess some of the questions are, how does that intersect with community? How do we find community? And how is it that not everybody is just kind of doing it for themselves, and everyone has a different notion, and everybody is coming in from a different place? So how are we all relating Jewishly? And then maybe even more challenging than that, how do we inspire our children to want to have that take hold and not just get lost in the wider society, especially here in America?
It's a great question. I'm laughing because just yesterday I started teaching this quarter at UC Irvine. I'm teaching modern Jewish thought, which essentially is 300 years of people trying to answer that exact question, starting with, Moses Mendelssohn to people opining on social media today. I'm going to counterintuitively say that there actually isn't a good answer in terms of I totally agree with the slippery slope. And this is, I think, what probably distinguishes me from a great number of non-Orthodox rabbis who would sort of poo-poo the question and say, no, you can totally do it. You can focus on values and community and continuity and maybe Zionism and all of these things. I do think that. I do think those can be, good placeholders at time. But I do think this sort of is the question of our age, and by our age I mean since 1750, for the Jewish community of, if you, for what I believe to be convincing philosophic and epistemologic reasons, can no longer accept the traditional narrative of God coming to the Jewish people on a mountain, 3,300 years ago and giving us the Torah. How do you then ensure Jewish commitment and Jewish continuity? It is an extremely difficult question. And so I would be lying if I told you I had, answers. I do have reservations, and I've actually found myself oftentimes when talking to students, I do default to the traditional answer. And I do think if somebody is approaching Judaism for the first time, not within the sense of an academic class, but if they come to me as a rabbi and they are interested in learning about Judaism and about our origins and, Jewish law and all of these things, my default will be to do the traditional, pre-1700 answer that, any Jew would have received, which is, the Jews were slaves in Egypt, and then they wandered through the desert, and very much the classic narrative. Then if they push a little bit and they say, well, how can you believe this, or what about this? Then I'll sort of go into my other approach. But I agree with you in terms of the slippery slope. I think people who don't think there's a slippery slope are sort of, deluding themselves. I will say on the slippery slope question is there's always a question of, the slope is always slippery, right? And I say this because, I think just yesterday there was the terrible news of the 14-year-old Haredi boy who was run over by an Israeli bus driver. And just for people who haven't read that story yet, they're probably familiar with the fact that for 2 generations, the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community in Israel has not wanted to serve in the army, and this has become a new major political issue in the last couple of years, given that all of Israeli society has essentially mobilized to the army, and so you have these massive protests by the ultra-Orthodox community of saying, we don't want to serve in the army, and for them, they view that as a slippery slope. So the slippery slope is always there, and they're actually right about that. Not that I agree with their right? Like, I don't agree with their decision. I think Haredim should be in the army. But they are also correct that if Haredi society in mass went to the Israeli army, they would have a lot more people assimilate into Israel. It's going to change.
Yeah. I think that what you've, I don't want to say stumbled across, but really, or almost elevated yourself to, in many regards, has probably encouraged you to have these kinds of discussions and to make this rich for all of the thinking that's going on. And along those lines, your podcast, as I mentioned, is called The Fifth Question. And as many of us know in the Seder, the 4 questions are asked by the children to the parents. Who is your 5th question for? Is it for the rabbis, the critics, or the people who feel homeless in today's polarized discourse?
I think hopefully the last one. I think, I've always loved Pesach. It's always been my favorite holiday. I think Pesach encapsulates so much of what I love about Jewish tradition. You have this dynamic, changing, innovative, part meal, part intellectual academic symposium, part, family, chaotic, sing along dinner where every year Jews have gathered for thousands of years to discuss not just our history, but our values and our stories and tradition, and every generation is sort of added to the past, and it's a intergenerational event. And so, just the Passover Seder has always had this place of just Jewish mystique in my mind that just, surpasses any other Jewish ritual. I actually started blogging when I was in college, when I was leaving the Orthodox community. I no longer write for it, but I decided to name my blog name Who Knows One after the song Echad Mi Yodea. And there my tagline was sort of, many people have certainty in this world, and they say, I know God doesn't exist, or I know God does exist, or I know exactly what God wants. And at the time I said, I feel like I don't know anything. I don't know any of the answers to these big questions. And so that's why I kind of named it like Who Knows One. It's almost like this, philosophic question of like no one, right? Like, the whole point is that none of us really know. We're all just guessing. And I think in some vein, the 5th question is similar, where of course, you have the 4 questions that everyone's probably familiar with. Why is this night different from other nights? But I think the 5th question is sort of everything else in Jewish tradition that might not have such a clear-cut answer, right? It's obvious why this night we dip twice and not, and other nights we don't dip at all, right? It's because, Jewish tradition tells us to dip twice. But it's not obvious, what again, will our great-great-great-great-grandchildren still be practicing the Seder? Will they still be doing it in America? Will it still be safe for them? What will be the values that drive it? What will be, and so in my mind, it's just, everything else, like all the other questions that Jews are asking.
Why are you such a strong Zionist?
I think for a couple of reasons. One, I do think in some way that Israel is one just, unapologetically, the Jewish indigenous homeland. And so I think in many ways, Zionism in a liberal context should be viewed as a very successful decolonialist, indigenous rights, returning to an ancient homeland movement. I'm sort of shocked. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be shocked at this point, but it's surprising that people that are progressive champions that talk about things like this are not holding up Zionism as a paragon of success. Here you have these people. I mean, I probably don't have to tell your listeners, but, we've kept alive a dream of thousands of years. And this wasn't purely hypothetical and academic. I mean, for those that are familiar with, the Siddur, the prayer book, it's, 3 times a day, Jews pray to go back to Israel. Every time you eat bread and, say the blessing afterwards, you pray to go back to Israel. Every major Jewish holiday, you pray to go back to Israel. I just officiated a wedding on Sunday. At the end of the wedding, you break a glass because Jerusalem is destroyed. So this is like, everywhere. You can't really get out of it in tradition. So one, it's, in the wider sort of universal setting, it's a Jewish return to our native homeland. And then from a Jewish traditional standpoint, I mean, what more incredible story of us thinking about, dreaming about, praying about this land for thousands of years, and now we are actually there. I mean, that's incredible. And when mixed with a lot of the political pressures that cause Zionism to move from this sort of esoteric, mystical, messianic movement, which it was, in the Middle Ages, to a modern political movement, with people like Moshe Hess and then eventually, obviously, Theodor Herzl, I think they were just correct in the most blunt of senses. In other words, Moshe, starting with, Moses Hess in Germany and then, Herzl a couple years later, they diagnosed the problem of anti-Semitism as essentially saying other Jewish thinkers in Europe in the 1800s think that anti-Semitism could essentially be solved, right? How you solve it is anyone's guess, but the early reform movement thought, anti-Semitism could be solved if Judaism becomes more religious-like and, creeps away from the public sphere and just becomes, internal and confessional, similar to Protestantism, right? That was certainly both the German Reform movement and the American Reform movement's worldview, right? You obviously have, the Bund, who are modeled after, socialists and, even Marx himself, that essentially says, if you fix economic struggle and, everything else, then anti-Semitism will sort of just fall away as a byproduct. You had other, right? So you had all these different views of how to fix anti-Semitism within a society, and people were really hopeful throughout the 1800s. I mean, this was a great time of hope in the Jewish community. And then you have Moshe Hess, who's writing in 1864, I believe, who has this famous line. I mean, it's one of my favorite lines in 1800s Jewish literature, where he's writing about the reform movement in Germany. And again, this is 70 years before, Nazism rises. And he says, the Jewish reformers are deluding themselves if they think that anti-Semitism can be solved with some reforms to the Jewish prayer book. He says, the German anti-Semite hates the Jewish nose much more than he hates the Jewish scripture. And essentially what he was saying is, anti-Semitism is not going away, right? In some way, they were anti-Semitism essentialists in saying anti-Semitism can't be cured; it can only be managed. And because it can't be cured,
and having the Jewish state, though, I mean, that certainly hasn't made anti-Semitism go away. Maybe you could say it's concentrated it and amplified it. Even, I mean, maybe it's on everybody's radar. Maybe the people hate us even more now. And I'm a staunch Zionist, but I'm just wondering, like, having Israel didn't make anti-Semitism go away.
No, certainly not. And you might be right. It might have led to an increase or decrease. Hard to know. But their point wasn't that you can solve anti-Semitism. Their point was that anti-Semitism could only be managed. And so their point was, I don't know if you have I'm coming up with a thought experiment on the spot, so it might be bad. But, right, like if you know somebody's going to break into your house, you're gonna maybe get a big dog and maybe get a weapon and, build a big, steel gate there. Right now, somebody might try to convince you that you can dissuade that person from breaking into your house. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But if they're wrong, you're going to be very happy you have that gate. And that was essentially Herzl's point. Herzl didn't think, or, Herzl's a little bit different because he had the socialistic impulse. But, later Zionist thinkers, in the early 1900s, they weren't naive enough to think that anti-Semitism is just going to be a solved issue. They did think it would get better, once Jews are on the, a nation state just like anyone else. But ultimately they said, well, if you think there's a good chance that guy's going to come break into your house, it's best to have that, giant iron gate protecting you. And so, at least in the political sense, the question of whether or not Israel's actually made anti-Semitism better or worse is kind of irrelevant, I think, in that sense. Obviously, it's an important question for, Jewish community today, but I don't think that should dictate one's being a Zionist or not. It is true that the global Jewish community is certainly more protected because we have the state of Israel. I mean, there would be 1 million Jews from the Soviet Union that essentially would have been lost to Jewish history if it wasn't for Israel in the 90s, or would have been, hundreds of thousands of Jews from the Arab world in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that probably would have either been, killed, tortured, or, I mean, things aren't going great for the Yazidis or Coptic Christians or all these other minority groups in the Middle East. And Jews, would have been just another news story of, oh, okay, I guess 120, Yazidi women were killed today. We would have been seeing those about Jews if Jews had stayed in these countries. And so, yes, things like October 7th, wouldn't have happened without Israel. But what I told students, because I was on campus during October 7th, and what I actually said at a vigil, I think 2 or 3 days after October 7th, is that 150 years ago, during the era of, just these massive Eastern European pogroms, the thing that a pogrom inspired was more pogroms. In other words, if October 7th had happened 100 years ago, it wouldn't have led to, okay, as Israel as a state needs to get its, crap together, and Jews have to come, worldwide and, hold these massive vigils and all of that. It would have actually led to going inside and cowering in fear that another pogrom is going to come. And the fact that we have Israel, again, there was an uptick in anti-Semitism, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it would have been, say in the Eastern European equivalent in, 1770.
So for you, and you could ask me the same question, but why are you not moving to Israel? Why are you not making Aliyah?
It's a great question. One, because nothing I said in terms of my reasons to be a Zionist have anything to do with actually living in the land of Israel. It is a tension. It's funny. I was actually just talking about this with a bunch of people at Shul last week. So one, there always have been Jews in the diaspora, which I think is just an important historic tidbit for people to know, starting with, even before the Babylonian exile, just for those that, know their history. There were Jewish groups living in Egypt as early as the 7th century BCE, maybe even the 8th century in places like Babylon. So there was always Jews that were living outside of what we consider to be, mainstream Israel. Even in the story of the Torah, right, you have, half or a third of the tribes asking, hey, we don't even want to cross the Jordan. The pastures are better for our flock on the other side of the Jordan. We'll come help you win the war. But then, Reuven, Gad, and some of Manasseh, we're going to stay here in Jordan. So even they were saying, hey, if, conditions are better in quote unquote exile, we're going to stay there. And so I think, it's important to recognize that. I do think Jewish life in America is generally pretty good. Would I place all of my eggs in that basket of, probably not. I'm glad Israel exists as sort of the American Jewish insurance policy. And I do think it's incumbent on American Jews to support Israel. And I also think educationally, in both of our work and trying to inspire people to understand that Judaism is much more than a religion taking place in a synagogue that they do or don't go to once a week or maybe once a year with some people. So Israel is very important for that in terms of, this incredible cultural center that people can go to. But in my personal life, I mean, one, I'm comfortable in America. I mean, I hate to be that, blunt about it. It just is a comfortable place to live. I do generally feel safe. And also just ideologically, I think I can fulfill a Jewish mission here a lot better than I'd be able to in Israel, in terms of, again, essentially, I know I said originally what I wanted to do with Kiruv, and then I sort of moved away from that. But essentially what I do is still Kiruv. I mean, I'm taking people that don't have much of a Jewish identity and connection to Jewish tradition. Most of the students that I serve are not coming from traditional backgrounds. Very few people have ever, before I meet them, even heard of things like the Talmud, and, I'm enriching them within this Jewish life, both the intellectual tradition and just the Jewish culture. And the reality is I just wouldn't be able to do that in Israel. I'm curious if your answer would be similar.
I kind of want to go down a rabbit hole with you, if I may, along those lines, because the population that we're serving, and I mean, we look at the statistics, and I think they've changed a little bit since October 7th in 2023, but so many of our brothers and sisters are finding partners outside of the Jewish people. And you're probably, I'm pretty positive that you're dealing with the products of that oftentimes, finding their way to university. What kind of perspective, what insight do you have on this phenomenon that we have? Maybe I think it's a unique phenomenon in Jewish history that we've had this kind of quote unquote assimilation to the point that we're not finding Jewish spouses. And by the way, some people are criticizing me even tackling this and saying, let's not make the people feel bad who have non-Jewish spouses. And believe me, I'm not spending time making those people feel bad. I'm spending my time welcoming those people and loving those people. And everybody's welcome in my shul, whether you're Jewish or not. Everybody's spouse is welcome. I think people, and anyone who's come to my shul knows that. I was just telling somebody, like, the person who sponsored the Kiddush last week isn't even Jewish. So I'm not trying to say that I don't value non-Jews in the equation. I'm just saying, any way you look at it, it's a tremendous challenge. And how does that come across? How do you interface with that? What's your insight? Take it away.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I also don't shy away from talking about any and all these things, to some people's chagrin. Most people appreciate it. I'll say a couple things. One of the interesting differences between maybe young Jews in America in the last 20 or 30 years and the last 200 years of Jewish history, where there wasn't as high rates of assimilation, but, Jews marrying non-Jews, and even, in the early Haskalah period, in Germany in the 1800s, many Jews actually converted to Christianity to try to assimilate. So it's not a completely new phenomenon. I will say what's different is there are a lot of young Jews who are themselves planning on marrying people who aren't Jewish, but very much care to still remain a part of Jewish community. That's something new. That's not something that would have happened 100 years ago. In other words, 100 years ago, it was almost definitional that if you're a Jew who chose not to marry Jewish, therefore that proves you don't care about Judaism, and it would have been almost a one-to-one relation. Today, you don't have that, which is both incredible and also creates actually a big struggle, not struggle in terms of personal, but the issue that keeps me up at night, I think this is pretty related to your question, is we are now at a point where between the Orthodox community and non-Orthodox community in America, we effectively have two different definitions of what it means to be Jewish, and subsequently two different Jewish communities, in the sense of, I would say probably 20 to 30% of my students are not halachically Jewish, in the sense of either their parents, only their dad is Jewish and not mom, or or maybe their mom or grandmother converted through a non-Orthodox Beit Din, Reform, Reconstructionist, even conservatives not accepted by Orthodox, and their kids still want to have very rich Jewish lives. I now essentially just, in my mind, just have two different definitions of Jewishness. I think that, there is the halachic definition and there is the Jewish peoplehood definition, and these are not the same thing. And the analogy I always give, I've been thinking about this analogy a lot because I talk to a lot of students who are in this position that themselves struggle with their own Jewish identity because maybe they've been told by, Chabad or the like that, oh, you're not actually Jewish, is, let's say I were to move to France and, spend a couple of years there, but, everyone knows I grew up in San Diego and I've never lived, aside from a brief stint in Israel, I've lived my whole life in America. I'm an American citizen. But let's say after a couple of years in France, I say, I want to revoke my American citizenship, right? Totally legal thing to do. The question is, am I still American or not? It's an interesting question because on one level, no, right? Legally, I am no longer American, right? If I tried to come to America to visit, I would need a visa and, a green card and all those things. On the other hand, somebody looking at me would be like, yeah, dude, of course you're American, right? You can't just give up, your Americanness is not contingent on you, filing some paperwork online. And I've started thinking about Jewish identity in the same way. In other words, patrilineal Jews who are involved in the Jewish community, like, they're Jewish the same way that I'd be American in that, case I just gave. Like, yeah, you're Jewish. You talk the Jewish talk. You're involved in Jewish community. You're doing all the Jewish things. If you wanted to say, officially legalize it in a way that, open doors to some of the more legalistic parts of Jewish tradition, say counting in an Orthodox minyan or serving as a witness for the Orthodox community or anything like that, like, yeah, you got to apply for the paperwork and you got to do all the things, but that doesn't call into question your fundamental Jewishness the same way me revoking my American citizenship, I don't think would call into question my Americanness. But again, it is a very fraught issue because nobody likes to be told, if somebody's had an identity their whole life that they're Jewish, you don't want to be told like, oh, actually, in some way your Jewishness is lacking. So the question of Jews marrying non-Jews, it is a very difficult question. And I would say, just the last thing, and then I'm curious if you agree or disagree with this. I know we talked about this a little bit offline. I've started using the language, in Jewish law, there's a language called lechatchila and b'diavad. And just to translate that for listeners, lechatchila means a priori or ideal. B'diavad is post facto or post hoc. So the two ways to view it is, let's say somebody asks the question of, can I make kiddush Friday night over orange juice, right? Let's say I just don't like the taste of wine. Can I use orange? This is a very banal example. What most rabbis would say is, listen, ideally no, right? Ideally you use wine or grape juice. If you don't have grape juice, you actually use challah, then you use beer, right? There's a whole hierarchy of things that you do before orange juice. But if you come to me and say, hey, Rabbi, I did this crazy thing. I made kiddush over orange juice. Did it count? Do I need to make it again? What any rabbi should say is, no. Post facto, b'diavad, like you did it, it's fine. I'm not going to say you're a terrible Jew and whatever. I think I've started viewing intermarriage through that prism. It's not ideal. People get upset at me for saying that. I think all things equal, Jews who want to be a big part of the Jewish community and, have their life revolve around Jewish tradition, it is better and easier. And, you secure your chances of your kids wanting to be Jewish a lot more if you marry Jewish. That said, if somebody marries a non-Jew, do you kick them out of the community? Do you push them away? Do you spend every conversation with them talking about how terrible they are? No. You say, okay, you made kiddush over orange juice. Like, let's move on from there. If you have practical questions about maybe conversion down the road or something, great. If you don't, and you just want to remain a part of a Jewish community, with a non-Jewish spouse, like, great as well.
I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, one thing that's leading me down another point, and any one of these could be a whole episode in and of itself, though, so I kind of hesitate to do this because I have other things I want to talk to you about. But because here you are, outside the Orthodox, you've removed yourself from the heading, if you will, of Orthodoxy. And at the same time, I think Orthodoxy is so much not traditional Judaism, and I think we kind of hold it as the gold standard. And on the one hand, I'm very much committed to halakha, and I don't see halakha necessarily the way the conservative movement or those who call themselves Orthodox do. I would say I'm much more attracted to classical Sephardic thinking. It's not about an orthodoxy with its own artificial pressures that's in many ways is more Christian than Jewish. So when you talk about gerut, or you talk about conversion, or what I would call, I think similar language, I would call that naturalization into the Jewish people. Yes, I think politically you're 100% right that it's going to be a problem if you're not recognized by the quote-unquote orthodoxy. But on the other hand, who are these Orthodox people, and who is this rabbinate, and that you're even part of the Rabbanut in Israel on paper in a certain sense. It's just a lot of questions here. And what do we think is real traditional Judaism? And is it the people that dress in black and white all the time or wear streimlach on their hat? Are those the real Jews? How about the Hasidim? So how does this all factor into the calculus of what you're talking about? And how am I wrong?
No, I don't. I think, I partially agree, partially disagree. Think, going back to our conversation of Judaism as this, alive and growing organism, is it kind of allows for two things. One, there never was one Jewish view ever in our history, right? Because I believe that everything was always evolving bottom up, even internally within the Torah, you have contradictory ideas. Certainly you have contradictory ideas within the wider Hebrew Bible. Last semester I was teaching a class on Hebrew Bible, and one of the things I had students do at the end is just compare, the views on life in books like, Kohelet or Ecclesiastes to Deuteronomy and Devarim. I mean, these are just wildly different philosophies of life. The book of Ezra and the book of Ruth clearly have a disagreement about the essence of Jewish identity. Ruth allows for conversion. Ezra is very obsessed with what today we would call race, right? He says, the Jewish seed. And so, meaning to say that this mythical idea that we've had, this one pure type essentialized Jewish idea that we could, unearth from the ground and then practice as like the ideal Judaism. That's a facade. We've always had Jewish ideas, and there's always been a range or a spectrum or Overton window of acceptable ideas. And at any given point in Jewish history, if you become too traditional or too liberal, you kind of fall off the bandwagon. I'll give two obvious examples. Christianity is the obvious liberalizing example. Early on, it might have, if it was just Jesus, it may have been the case that it just would have ended up being some other branch of Judaism. But then, once Paul starts talking about abolishing the law and you don't need circumcision and you don't actually need to be ethnically Jewish, right? Neither Jew nor Gentile. Essentially, Paul, as a Jew, right? He was trying to make Christianity, be accepted as universal Jewish tradition. He just kind of went off the path, and Jews just stopped caring what Christians had to think as a part of our own tradition, right? That was an example of liberalizing too fast. On the other side, today, still, there's a group in Israel called the Samaritans, right? Many people know that from Good Samaritans in the New Testament. Dwindling, this tiny ethnic group. And the Samaritans, they have a little bit of a murky history, but essentially, the mainstream historic perspective on them is when many of the Jews were exiled during the Babylonian exile, which from the academic perspective was a time of major development of Judaism in those 70 years of exile. Many of the Samaritans actually stayed in, the region of Samaria, right, in the modern-day northern West Bank, and they kept practicing a lot of rituals in their earliest form, and then when the second temple was destroyed, they just kept doing it. So you can actually go on YouTube today and type in Samaritan Passover, and they still offer a Korban Pesach, a Passover offering, and it reads exactly like you would expect from reading the book of Exodus and Leviticus in terms of what is demanded of the Passover sacrifice. They're slaughtering this lamb, they're taking the blood, they're painting it. And I always show this to students and I ask, is this Judaism? And they all say, no, of course not. And I say, well, it's funny because in some way this is the most, literalist reading of the Torah possible.
It's more Jewish. Yeah, it's like more Jewish in a way.
Exactly. And this is an example of a Jewish group that not refuse. I'm sort of, painting a narrative around them, but they stayed so traditional that they also kind of fell off the bandwagon. So meaning to say, I don't think that there's such a thing as what is the correct, authentic, right way to be Jewish. There's clearly you can dip off too quickly on one side. I do think with the modern ultra-Orthodox community, clearly to answer at least your narrow question, no one was wearing black hats even 200 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago, right? So that's obviously anachronistic. People weren't even wearing kippahs, 500 years ago. This is a much more recent thing in Jewish history. And so if somebody says, the only way to be Jewish is to essentially be in these insular communities and not teach your kids anything about the outside world, and, we were talking about the army before, shun army service and shun secular culture. If you keep doing that for a couple of generations, perhaps that ceases to be, part of some main Jewish Overton window in a meaningful way. And the same way in the non-Orthodox community. I think, the most liberal end of the Jewish experience also, is coming up with rituals and ideas that, again, might cease to be Jewish in some, meaningful sense, off the left-wing side. But what makes me a pluralist, to get back to, what we were talking about before, is I think it's a pretty big Overton window. So I can look at a female Reform rabbi playing guitar to welcome in Shabbat, on a Friday night, and I can look at an ultra-Orthodox Jew in Borough Park who is just convinced that God only wants him to speak Yiddish and wear a black hat and anything else is treif. And my Judaism might not look like either of theirs, and in my mind, they're both, just part of the natural Overton window of Judaism.
Yeah, I feel that very, very similarly, and well said. And different than what we've been doing thus far in an era of 15-second sound bites, why have you leaned into long-form podcasting as the best way to preserve Jewish nuance?
I think it's because I'm very bad at the 15-second sound bites. I don't know if that makes for a good 15-second sound bite, but no, I think all you need to do is open up the Talmud and, the rabbis start off debating some, small issue of whether or not a spoon is kosher. And next thing you know, they're talking about a story about demons, and then they're talking about some historic story, and then talking about them hanging out at a wedding. And then 6 pages later, they go back to the story about the spoon. Like, Jews have never been good at, short form bullet statements. And in an interesting way, because I think this is an apt comparison, the exact time that Jews were creating the Talmud, which is, again, just the most anti-short form book you've ever read, the Christian world was convening, say the Council of Nicaea and coming up with these very well organized, couple of lines. Here is what we believe, here is the dogma. And so I think
opposite.
Exactly. And so Jewish tradition is just sort of like, it's all about the nuance, and every line, has commentary, which has other commentaries on it. And it's just very hard to do anything in short form. So even when I record, even after an hour, a lot of times I'm thinking like, oh my God, this could have been, a 6-hour podcast.
You've stated that political parties have become idols in modern society, and you're also a principled centrist. So as a principled centrist, how do you keep your students and yourself from turning a political movement into a religion?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, just in terms of the idolatry idea, I think the idea of idols in Judaism is the idea that perfection doesn't exist in anything that's not God. And since God is fundamentally, above this world, anything you find in this world, whether it's an idea or a person or an ideology, is by definition not perfect. So I think anytime somebody has something they view as like infallible or above criticism or above, pushback, that's, ipso facto wrong. I think we're at an interesting time. People always say that. I think my job is, I think this goes back to a Hasidic thinker, but to comfort those who are afflicted and afflict those who are too comfortable. I think there are many young people today that just feel lost because we're in this postmodernist soup of no one knows what's true. No one knows if there are any values that are worth upholding. No one knows where they come from. Everything is, in 8-second sound bites. Everybody's attention is just, completely bifurcated, and people are just looking for identity. And so for those people, my job is not to complicate the world, even though I do think the world is very complicated. For those people, I do want to, create a nice, story of who they are, where they came from, their mission in the world. On the other hand, I also meet a lot of people that come in and they're not conflicted. They think they know exactly what needs to happen, whether it's, they're very right-wing politically or very progressive politically, and they don't understand why those idiots who vote the other way are just so dumb and stupid. And so whenever talking to them, I want to always be essentially, the other side. So many of my conservative friends think that I'm liberal. Many of my liberal friends think that I'm conservative. I just had 2 phone calls. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a rabbi this morning, and we were talking about the recent news and Trump and Venezuela. And I was sort of giving a defense for what America did. And he's like, it's interesting. You're the one friend of mine who's a Trump supporter. And I stopped him. I'm like, Michael, I'm not a Trump supporter. Like, I've never voted for Trump. I don't think Trump is great. And then on the flip side, I'm meeting up with a bunch of my high school friends in a couple of weeks just for Shabbat. And they're all much more to the right than I am. And when I was talking to them this morning, they're like, "Oh, well, you're super liberal, so you must think this." So I'm very glad that
you get it from both sides.
Exactly, but it's more fun that way.
How do we practically teach people to find the spark of truth in an opponent's argument without feeling like they are betraying their own convictions?
I think just being honest. I think people are afraid, especially if they're in an ideologic disagreement, to give credence to the other side. It's funny because it's never been a Jewish idea to do that. Everyone always talks about the Hillel Shammai dynamic in the Talmud, where the reason why Jewish tradition ends up following Hillel is because he was willing to always understand and even state Shammai's argument first. And so it is a prerequisite, in my opinion, to truly understanding why you believe something, to being able to lay out your opponent's argument in a way that your opponent would actually agree with. In other words, I'm a Zionist, and I be very much so. But I think I'd be able to state an anti-Zionist criticism in a way that an anti-Zionist listening to this podcast would say, like, yes, he has it right. Then I would disagree with that point. But if you're not able to do that, you're actually not arguing with real ideas or people. You're arguing against straw men, which so oftentimes happens today. But I just don't think that's helpful. And I think there are enough people out there, especially given that social media and the news today is so interested in not doing that, and many people are just content listening to exactly people who they agree with or diametrically disagree with, because people also like, enraging themselves, right? I think a lot of psychology research has shown that. And I kind of want to not do either. I want to say, hey, you can break this down. You can have very nuanced thinking about this. I've openly said on the podcast many times, I've changed my mind about this, or I don't actually know what I think about this, or my favorite thing to say is I have, two minds about this, and I constantly am debating this question. And I think that's just a lot more honest than saying that I always know exactly what I think about every issue, which, of course is not true.
It's a fresh way to think, especially at this time in our history. You've noted that modern anti-Zionist rhetoric often mirrors Soviet-era propaganda. How can Jewish students combat an ideology that has such deep historical roots in the very academic institutions where they are trying to learn?
So one, I think people need to better understand the history of Soviet anti-Zionism to really understand where this is coming from. There's a lot of people doing great work about this. Oftentimes, this is portrayed as, the staunch anti-Zionist, criticism of Israel as this grassroots, bottom-up movement of a bunch of people who just really care about Palestinian suffering. And if you look historically, the roots of this are actually a lot more pernicious. They're top-down roots that are mirrored in a lot of extremely anti-Semitic tropes that are then just hoisted onto the state of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who criticizes Israel or everyone who cares about Palestinian suffering is doing this, but people need to be, right, the only way to be able to very quickly have the sort of sniff test of if you see something, is this anti-Zionism, right, which is, bad, or is this just a reasonable criticism of Israel, which is totally fine? The only way to be able to get to that point where you can kind of tell almost immediately is by studying the history, because again, there's a lot of obfuscation of what exactly is what, and I think that many anti-Zionist movements have purposely tried to mix up the language, and they voice things in a modern progressive tone, but really their views are anything but progressive. And so I think, again, it's sad that it's the reality, but I think it's incumbent among the Jewish community to really understand these terms and where they're coming from, because it's probably not going to get better in the next couple of years.
Isn't that overwhelming, though, for Jewish students? I mean, you just want to be, and I almost feel like the caricature of the American Jew is, or maybe the Jew in general, is just leave us alone. You just want to live your life. You just want to be under the radar. And you're you have to study a Soviet era, this and that. You have to understand all this. And I mean, it's like the prerequisite. And almost like before you can learn Talmud, you have to know all of the Tanakh really to understand what's going on. You really have to know all the Mishnayot. And really, you have to know Aramit. You have to know Aramaic before you do it. And well, how are you going to learn Aramaic? Rabbinic Aramaic. You can only learn that by probably you're going to study Talmud in order to find that Aramaic. I mean, it's how do you? Isn't it lofty for our brothers and sisters to do what? And I don't, in a way, I really don't disagree at all with what you're saying.
Oh, listen, I don't think it's not a reasonable thing to think that everybody's actually going to do it. But I tend to be a very much of an idealist in terms of my educational philosophy. I was, even just at my first class yesterday, I essentially said, listen, I'm not going to run your assignments through a ChatGPT checker, but here's why for your own sake you shouldn't do it, because, these values of ideas and education and, bettering yourself. Do I think that, there's 60 students in the class, do I think they're all going to listen to that and all say, I'm not going to use ChatGPT because of this idealism? No, I'm sure, some big percentage will do it. But in some sense, those who want it, I want to be able to provide a roadmap to how to actually accomplish this. And I have seen over the years students who really want to understand the nuances of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Zionist, anti-Zionist debate that, actually take up, recommendations. And now these are people that even, there's one student who graduated years ago who is now a lawyer in Los Angeles. I'll have to send him this podcast because I'm talking about him in a flattering way. And when I first met him, he knew very little about, both Judaism, Jewish history, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was just somebody who was very interested in politics. And over the course of his undergrad We actually took 3 different trips to Israel, doing different educational trips together. We took trips to Washington, D.C. to go to Israeli political conferences and, have just stayed in touch. And now when news breaks, sometimes I'll call him to ask him his opinion because I value it so much, because we oftentimes disagree also in terms of politics. And so, when things like that can happen, it definitely makes me a lot more optimistic. But yeah, I mean, I do think part of the problem is that Judaism is just a whole world. It's a whole world that's separate from this, American cultural world. I don't have a good idea for how Judaism in the diaspora can survive outside of, more insular communities such as Orthodoxy, because again, Judaism did not evolve to be a confessional religion that has nothing to do with politics and nothing to do with, governance and anything like that. Judaism in its traditional form, Jewish law does not differentiate between religious and civil law, right? The example I give is if you want to know, when exactly the Yom Kippur fast ends, you ask a rabbi, and if I accidentally bump into your car leaving the parking lot, that's equally Jewish law as, when a cheeseburger becomes not kosher, and anything like that. And of course, the Talmud doesn't differentiate, and historically, Jewish communities hadn't differentiated. It was only in the last 200 years in the West that we've pulled apart this thing called, ceremonial religious ritual Judaism from Judaism. And it seems like we haven't had much success of that being able to be enough of a political or a social force to keeping communities together, which I think is what we're seeing outside of the Orthodox community. So it is a tough problem.
Reflecting on your time at UC Irvine, what's the biggest misconception people have about what is actually happening to Jewish life on campus today?
My answer might have been different before October 7th, so I'll be honest about that. UC Irvine's always been kind of known as a, hotbed for anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. When I was applying to college in 2010, my parents, and they were, I think, probably right about this. Again, I wasn't around UC Irvine in 2010. They told me not to apply to UCI because of anti-Semitism. And people that I've talked to that have been around this community, for 20, 30 years have sort of, agreed with that statement, that it was very bad. When I got here in 2017. This was right after 5 years at UCLA. I did undergrad and grad school at UCLA. There was no more obvious public anti-Semitism than there was at UCLA. My hunch, and I think after October 7th, my hunch is proven correct. It's not that UC Irvine's gotten better. It's just everywhere else has caught up. And so in 2009 or 2010, it was considered like a national scandal and craziness that you would have, a very public anti-Zionist week with this huge billboard and, poster situation set up in the middle of campus talking about all these libels against Israel. That would have been like, oh my goodness, what is happening? Now every campus in the country has, an anti-Zionist week and a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter that, is just their entire job is just carrying out, anti-Zionist libels against the Jewish state. And then post-October 7th, with the encampment movement and everything there, UCI wasn't a great place to be, but it wasn't any worse than any other UC. And so it's not to say that things are terrible. And, I walk around with a kippah every day and feel, safe. And, the campus administration has been great. But I think the reality is post-October 7th has taught us that Jews have kind of re-entered history, right? I think we were kind of on a vacation from Jewish history over the last 30 or 40 years, and anti-Semitism was this hypothetical, theoretical thing that happened a long time ago. Maybe every couple months we're reminded of it when something like, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting happens, and then everybody's like, oh my God, yeah, anti-Semitism, that exists. But after October 7th, just in a major way, it's just been on everyone's mind 24/7. And the reality is, just like at any other time in Jewish history, going to campus, again, it's not, nearly as dangerous and fraught as at other times in history, but you're not going to be totally intellectually and ideologically and socially and sometimes even physically safe as a Jew. There are clubs that won't want you in and social groups that won't want you in and professors and grad students that are going to be, discriminatory towards you. And in some cases, maybe even at times, physical things. That said, the benefits certainly outweigh the cost of what you can gain at one of these universities, both Jewishly and just in terms of being a part of American society writ large. So it's not the nicest answer. It's not like, oh yeah, everything's great, or it's not an answer saying like everything's terrible, like, we have no hope. It's sort of a middle of the road of like, yeah, it's not going to be perfect. If I talk to a lot of parents, your kid might experience some anti-Semitism over the course of your 4 years, but if they do, there's a big community to have their back, and the administration really cares. And ultimately, what they're going to gain after 4 years being here is going to be much more than the potential risk that something, awful will happen to them.
I want to do some fast takes. Food debate here. I heard that you're a champion of Persian cuisine. Is that correct?
I am. My wife is Persian.
All right. Wonderful. If you had to choose a world without Persian spices or a world without Ashkenazi cholent, what would you choose?
Oh, for sure without Ashkenazi cholent.
All right. What is one book, Jewish or secular, that every principled centrist must read?
Ooh, Principled Centrist. There's a book, one of my favorite books is As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. And I think for like a centrist-y view on Judaism as a religion, it's not a political book, but it's just an incredible book of historic fiction. It talks about Talmud, talks about philosophy. That's been one of my favorite books.
Nice. I just picked up that book. I was going through some books, and I read it years ago, but I just came across it recently. If you could interview anyone from Jewish history on the fifth question, who would it be, and what is the first thing you'd ask them?
I think it would have to be Maimonides. I feel like I probably should have picked some biblical figure because that would be more exotic, to go more back in time, but only because I've been teaching about, Maimonides / Rambam for so many years, and there's such a debate about what he actually thought about anything because he's purposely cryptic, and I think I would just say, like, the floor is yours. I'm not going to talk at all. Like, what do you actually believe about God, Judaism, religion? Like, talk. And then I'd shut up for 45 minutes.
And he'd probably answer you in Judeo-Arabic, and then you'd be like, will you put it through ChatGPT? And then
Exactly. I'd have to put out the transcript. Or he'd probably spend 45 minutes being perfectly, very eloquent, but obviously obscuring what he actually thinks, and we'd be stuck with the same problem 45 minutes later.
I would go with Rambam also. I like that. What would you say to the 20-year-old Daniel Levine sitting in yeshiva, unaware of the journey ahead?
I don't know if I would say anything. I think I'm very happy with how the last 10 to 12 years have turned out. There were definitely times when I was still within a full Orthodox ideologic framework that I was in social situations where, because of my view of what Jewish law demanded, I acted in ways that now I'm embarrassed about, in terms of just the very blunt, black and white refusal to bend, what I believed was what I needed to do. And, I oftentimes didn't take into account the human cost of, you can't just have your way in every single situation. So maybe I would try to, temper that a little bit, but I don't think I would have wanted to say anything that would have drastically caused like a early pivot, because I think the journey, the intellectual journey, was very important to just how I view the world now, which is just to be critical, question assumptions. Whenever I talk to people that have very strong black and white views, I totally get where they're coming from, because I used to have that. I'm very, I have a very easy time separating people's views from their essential value as a person, because, if you would have met me 12 years ago, I would have had very different views and, still would have been the same person. So probably I would have just said nothing.
Rabbi Daniel Levine, thank you so much for gracing us on the Rabbi Avi Show. Appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.